Yeah.
Not easy work. Still.
No. So I might try to open this window here and see if I can't catch some sort of a breeze.
I've got my air conditioner. Can you guys hear it? Is it an issue for anyone?
Good.
All right.
Sounds good.
I'll turn it off if you want, but I'm going to start sweating.
Leave it on. I got a fan behind me, so.
Nobody wants to do that. Yeah. Who's this character down on the bottom? Is that Rhonda?
Rhonda looks different.
Yeah.
She grew a beard in the past few weeks.
So for some reason, my internet connection lately has been on and off. So if I cut out, someone just let me know. I've been moving around the house and different locations seem to work better than others. So hopefully this is a good location.
All right.
Will do. It is 6, but I think we need to. I'd like to wait a little bit before getting started because at least for item 2, we don't have the right people here yet. And I guess the only one who said they were going to be absent was Miss LeBlanc, right?
Yep.
So I was looking over the comprehensive plan. Matt, you're going to have to let us know what that situation was like. I see your name on the last 2010 comprehensive plan.
Right. I actually only know part of it. I left the country partway through the process, so I don't actually know what happened at the end.
Okay.
So
I was with the New Auburn Master Plan 2008 to 10. So
I know Dan Carroll was also, I think, on the.
Yep, his name is on there.
Yep.
he was on the master plan.
He was on the comp plan.
Right.
We have a quorum, but there's only 4. So if we're voting, I'm not sure if we're voting on the subcommittees, but we need at least.
We're not. Yeah, if we're voting, we can still do that. I think we're waiting on Mr. Bergeron, Mr. Carroll, and Mr. Finnegan.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
So, I don't know. Let's get started, I guess. Well, we'll wait till Evan comes back in the picture. We are, yeah. All right, so we're 3 or 4 past. I think we should call this meeting, October 11th, 2020, or August 11th, 2020 meeting of the City of Auburn Planning Board to order. We'll begin with a roll call vote.
I'll start. I'm Dana Staples. I'm an associate member.
Evan Sear.
Stephen Martelli.
I'm Matthew Duvall. I'm the chair. For the purposes of this meeting, at least for now, I would propose that the associate member, Mr. Staples, be elevated to full acting role for this evening, which means he will be able to vote and boy, I'm losing my words, motions. So given that, we'll move on to item 2, the approval of the May 12th minutes. I believe, let's see, we might actually not be able to do this.
I can vote for him, but I wasn't there.
So,
Yeah, so we have only 3 of us that were at that meeting are at this meeting.
That's correct.
There were, in fact, only 4 people at that meeting. So without Mr. Bergeron, we cannot do that. Oh, Mr. Bergeron, can you roll call yourself in, please?
Riley Bergeron, present.
Okay. As with Mr. Staples, Mr. Bergeron, who is an associate member, will act as a full member for this meeting, which means he will be able to vote and make motions. Now, with that, we will turn to the minutes of May 12th. Do I have a
motion to accept?
Motion to accept. Great. Do I have a second?
Second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
You want me to go down through the list, or
Sure. Yeah, we should do that.
Mr. Bergeron,
Yes.
this year,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
Staples.
I abstain.
Okay, yeah, and Chairman Duval.
Yes. Okay, with the arrival of Mr. Bergeron, we also have 4 people who were at the July 14th meeting. So we'll consider the July 14th minutes. Do I have a motion
to accept?
Second.
Okay.
Mr. Bergeron,
Yes.
Mr. Sear,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Abstain.
Mr. Staples,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yes. We should note, staff, that Mr. Martelli was not present at that meeting, so his abstention is.
Oh, if I can speak as a point of order, we generally don't, generally people that were not at a meeting don't vote on acceptance of the minutes. However, there's no prohibition on it if they can certify that they are familiar with the meeting itself. So,
Okay, great. Well, in this case, he abstained, so I think.
Right. As we move forward, if it becomes an issue again, for instance, if Mr. Bergeron hadn't jumped in, we still could have moved forward.
We could have, but he would have to vote.
Right. He'd have to certify that he made himself familiar with the meeting, and that when we accept the minutes, we're saying that the minutes essentially reflect the meeting itself, right? So.
Yep. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
We could have done that last week then, our last meeting, because I watched the video from May 14th.
Yeah, we could have done that, but we're
Man.
catching up. We'll talk about that more in item 7 tonight. All right, so moving on to item 3, we have a report on a housing growth discussion that City Council had on its workshop on August 3rd. Staff?
Yeah, so we provided a presentation to the City Council last week as part of a general discussion about opportunities to increase housing stock in the city. And there's a few reasons that we presented this to the city council. There's demand for increased housing opportunities. There's very little on the market, a lot of new construction, and a lot of people are moving in from out of town. The available workforce that we have is limiting business growth. Eric had given the example at the city council meeting of Moore and Brick. They feel that they aren't selling as much brick as they could be because the masons that install the brick can't find the help that they need. So just trying to find opportunities to increase the workforce in the city. With everything going on, the ability to work from home is likely to increase demand from Southern Maine employees. Some people that live further away might consider Auburn as a place to live now if they only have to commute a few days a week or not at all. There's an upward mobility and access to all types of housing. For example, we've added a lot of multifamily homes, but it's hard to find the entry-level single-family homes with not much on the market. So looking to create some opportunities for those, among others. The strategic plan, which we'll get into in item 4, but the strategic and comp plan goals encourage growing our housing stock by attracting new residents and providing for varied housing opportunities and quality housing. And one of the other reasons is that downtown viability depends on people with expendable income. So we don't have enough people to support the businesses downtown. So being able to provide more housing opportunities in the downtown and the surrounding areas will increase the amount of customers there to be able to support businesses in the downtown. So currently, we're in the process of looking into the capacity in services and schools to see what level the city could accommodate without creating any large incremental costs that might offset tax revenues of new housing. We think that we can continue to use the services efficiently, even with an increase in housing stock. We went through some data from 2015 to present, and we found that there's a lot of new single family and 9+ family unit buildings that were added in that time frame. We also identified 42 parcels that are currently zoned agriculture that the comp plan recommends being rezoned to a residential use. So we're in the process of working with a GIS consultant to identify those parcels and also to identify the house lots that exist in the city currently in residential zones that have the ability to add additional units on their lot. So this would be before any ordinance changes would have to take place. This is lots that exist currently that have the frontage, lot size to be able to expand now. And the council was in favor of that study to hopefully have a deliverable of a marketing tool that could reach out to those lot owners and let them know that they have the ability for some new units or lots on their current property. We discussed some opportunities for growth within existing residential areas. These are similar to what we've already discussed with the planning board. Backlots, for example, we discussed the planning board concerns about these, and it's an option that's out there, but we did let them know that the planning board has some concerns about a backlot provision, especially in those rural areas. Another option, the ordinance doesn't currently allow for a second principal structure in residential zoning districts. So a second unit would have to be attached to a house, or a lot would have to be split if it meets the requirements to do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to have a second structure on their lot. Tiny homes are something that are gaining a lot of popularity right now. Right now, we look at them as recreational vehicles. So they would have to be on a full foundation to be allowed in the city. Another issue that we have is we require at least 700 square feet minimum for a habitable dwelling unit. And so a lot of tiny homes obviously are a lot smaller than 700 square feet. So that kind of cancels them out. We also talked about cottage units, which are basically units within a neighborhood that has parking around the periphery, and they're kind of like walkable neighborhoods. They're only allowed in multifamily residential districts. And again, usually they're a lot smaller than 700 square feet. So that poses an issue, as well as the no more than one principal structure on a lot in a residential district. And lastly, we had talked about accessory dwelling units, basically in-law apartments. They're usually within existing structures, but they're another option to potentially increase housing opportunities in the city. So a couple of action items for the September 8th meeting that we're going to be bringing back to the City Council. They're in favor of a study to look at existing housing growth opportunities. We're hoping to have the mapping created within the next couple of weeks. So hopefully that's something that we can also bring back to the planning board in September. Council wanted some more information about how the 700 square foot minimum size for a dwelling unit came about, and if that's still something that's still relevant today. There seemed to be a little bit of support for a backlot provision, but they want some more thought put into that. They wanted to see the list of the 42 parcels that were recommended in the comp plan to go from ag to residential. So we're listing those and getting those mapped out for the September council meeting. And they're also looking for a cost impact analysis for downtown industrial areas to look at the cost of services in those areas. So we're in the process of working with the police department and fire department and the school to get some of that information. So that's a really brief overview of our discussion. We just wanted to keep the planning board updated on what's going on with the housing discussion. And if you have any feedback, happy to relay that back to the city council in September.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts or feedback from the board?
Good update. I mean,
Okay, hearing none. Thank you. Thank you, staff. Let's move on to, we had decided, or we had talked about moving item 5 to go before item 4. Is that correct?
Yeah, I thought that might be better, just so that we give an overview of the comp plan and then get into the presentation to the city council and what they're looking for from the planning board, if that's agreeable to everyone.
So I think under Robert's rules, I need a motion to do that.
so moved.
Second.
Okay,
Mr. Bergeron,
Yes.
Mr. Sear,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
Mr. Staples,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
yes. Thank you. So we will proceed with item 5 before item 4, and that is comprehensive plan and how it impacts planning board decisions. Staff?
Yeah, so before we dive into the next item, we just wanted to take a few minutes to go over what the comp plan is and how it impacts decisions that are made by the planning board. So in your packets this month, we provided a staff report that gives the planning board a general overview of the purpose of the comp plan and the most applicable sections for the planning board to consider. As part of your charge as a board, you have the jurisdiction and the authority to prepare and recommend a comprehensive plan to the city council and to prepare and recommend changes and amendments to the comprehensive plan as necessary. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we discuss the recent council meeting. But in a most general sense, the comp plan is the 10 to 20 year vision for the city. Auburn's was most recently updated in 2010. It's a good tool to be able to look at programs such as housing, economic development, public infrastructure and services, natural resources, demographics, local history, recreation, and land use, and to be able to offer guidance to those in the public and private sector as decisions are made that affect the city. So as we discussed in the staff report, there's 3 working parts to the comp plan. Policy recommendations, so actions needed to achieve the policies proposed, and the background information behind those. The section that the planning board is most focused on is a subsection of those. It's called the future land use plan, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with. It's an overall view that serves as a guide for future land use policies and ordinances in the city. It's used as the basis for creation of new zoning ordinances and maps. And it's important to note that the comprehensive plan is meant to be a fluid document. So for example, as the planning board reviews proposals and finds things in the comprehensive plan or the future land use plan that maybe aren't jiving with what is actually happening in the city, it's a good opportunity to recommend updates to the plan and to make sure it's on track to respond to any new challenges or opportunities that come up. We gave a little bit of background information on comprehensive plans in the staff report. All municipalities in Maine are required to have a comp plan. I actually worked with a few communities of less than 1,000 people on their comp plan updates, which you can imagine was pretty difficult. Communities are really small, limited staffing, and very few volunteers, but all Maine communities are required to have plans that are found to be consistent with state requirements, and that's across the board. So when a community updates their comp plan, they submit it to the state, and the state reviews it and either approves the plan or sends it back with changes that they're required to do to meet the state requirements. And we listed a few examples of those in the staff report as they pertain to the future land use map. So in order to, for example, to designate growth areas, it actually has to meet certain requirements that the state has laid out. And it's the same for rural areas, transition areas, and grant funding is actually issued a lot of times based on where these areas are designated. So as we discussed in the staff report, the future land use map designates the city into 3 land use types: growth areas, limited growth areas, and restricted or rural natural resource type areas. And within each of those categories are designations for residential and non-residential land uses, which are also referred to as the future land use designations. And we actually have these mapped on the website, and their intent on our GIS is to give someone an idea of where the land use designations are located, but not to be used at a parcel scale like a zoning district map, for example. The future land use designations each have their own suggested densities and land uses, which are used as a guide for where the city should be headed. We provided an example in the staff report of one issue that we recently encountered with a project where the future land use designation did not match up with the zoning ordinance. And this was mainly because a comprehensive rezoning was not completed after the adoption of the last comprehensive plan in 2010. So the planning board is essentially tasked with finding that projects be in compliance with, in that case, 2 almost conflicting density recommendations and standards. So while the comp plan has recommendations for density, it also gives the planning board the opportunity to consider if an alternative measure of development intensity may be more appropriate to reflect impacts of a development. So to try and get going on this, we provided a draft list of questions that the planning board can ask to determine if a project is in compliance with the comprehensive plan. And this is just a very basic first step list to consider. The first is just simple, what area is the project located in? And how should development occur or not occur in this area based on the character of the area? What's the suggested residential density category? And then we kind of get into the bigger questions, such as whether or not the development is in an area where alternative measures for development might be appropriate, if it's generally aligned with the objectives of the comp plan and the future land use plan, and the overall vision of the city and how the project fits into that. So the intent of those questions, I guess, was really to lay out a framework for what the role of the comp plan is and how the planning board should make decisions on whether or not a proposal is in conformance with the comp plan. I think the list is a good start to be thinking about how we want to frame those questions and that discussion so that it's consistent across the board for all projects that the planning board is reviewing. But I think it's a good starting point for the planning board to think about how we want to move forward with streamlining that process of determining consistency. So that's the general overview with our update.
Sorry, I was muted. Any questions, comments from anybody on the board?
Well, the comprehensive plan is supposed to work with the strategic plan also as a backup. Is one way of calling it. The strategic plan is to give the direction for the city in different areas, and then the comprehensive plan breaks that down into finer areas and resources that what we need.
Sorry, Mr. Martello, you were breaking up there, at least for me. You were saying that the strategic plan is the guidance for the city, and then the comprehensive plan provides.
Yeah, you break it up. Strategic plan is to work with the comprehensive plan.
Okay. Thank you. Other comments, thoughts? Okay, hearing none, I think if staff can proceed to item 4, the update on city council and their thoughts about the comprehensive plan update.
Yep. So sorry, I got a bunch of screens juggling here. Last week we sent out, let me just pull this up real quick so we can all talk about this. All right. I think this is the right one. So the planning board sent this correspondence document to the city council and had a few questions. You all can see the correspondence document, right? I just want to make, okay. I got a bunch of them up. I want to make sure it's the right one. So there were 3, specific questions that the planning board had for the city council. The first one was, what timeline does the city council have for the update process? And would the city council be willing to share that with the planning board? So this is the timeline that they have provided. Well, staff kind of shelled this out and they agreed that this is the timeline that they'd like to stick to. So work with the planning board and the council to prioritize and finalize a focus area list with a public forum. This would include the committee appointments, council, planning board, and I will, in a minute, I'll pull up the committee language that has been recommended to create that update committee. In October would be when we would begin the committee work and share the recommendations with the planning board and the council as they develop. and then begin the council adoptions in December or January. And then July of 2021 would be when the final recommendations are returned to City Council. So that's kind of the timeline that they've shelled out. Next question the planning board had was if it will have a role in the update process and if the City Council could share the specific duties that it envisions for the planning board in that process. City Council is, like we mentioned, proposing to create a committee for the update process, which they envision will have 2 planning board members. And for support staff, they were also hoping to have Mark Goslin from the Recreation Department, as well as a staff member from the Planning Department. In addition, the 2010 Comp Plan Committee actually had 40 plus members, and the City Council is planning to pull 3 members from that committee that would be considered legacy members that would be appointed by the City Council to the Comp Plan Update Committee. And lastly, the planning board wanted to have an opportunity to review and suggest additions to a list of topics to be considered in the future land use update. So staff had 5 topics that we had initially presented. And at the meeting, the City Council added 2 more to that list. And we're hoping tonight to get some more from the planning board. The 2 that were added by City Council were whether or not anything in the comp plan promotes inequity in the city. And the second was making sure that the future land use map in terms of access points into the city doesn't create any fragmentation areas. So I think the main purpose of that was making sure that there's not sections where you drive into town and you have a residential property and then you have a business property and then you have a residential property, making sure that there's actual clear zoning boundaries between those uses as part of the comp plan update. So tonight we're really hoping to see what the planning board has for thoughts on additions to this list. And we also wanted to take an opportunity to go over what is proposed for language for the committee that will be updating the comp plan, and hopefully create in live time, I guess, a communication back to the City Council that we could submit. Well, tomorrow it would have to be submitted, but it would be a communication from the planning board with your response to the council and your ideas on that committee and additional topics to consider.
Great, thank you. So before we dive into this, I wanted to just sort of circle back and remind people that our charge does indeed include preparing and delivering a comp plan to City Council. And so we have some latitude if there are parts of this response that or their proposal that you don't like, we have some latitude to propose changes back to them. So with that, I think we'll open up. Let's start, Megan, at the top with the timeline. How do members of the board have any comments or thoughts about the City Council's proposed timeline?
I remember hearing the City Council talk about this at a prior meeting, not this past one, but before that. And I think their goal was to not make this be a huge redo of the comp plan, but more to just kind of fine tune it here and there. But even so, that does seem like kind of a quick turnaround. I don't know. It sounds like a meeting a month, possibly 2 was in the language. So you probably can do it. I guess it depends on what the actual changes are going to be and how collaborative a process that's going to be. That was just my thought on the timeline.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? I will note, I just want to make a note that apparently Mr. Bergeron has had technical difficulties and he will be trying to rejoin us. He had to step away for a second.
All right.
Sort of to echo what Mr. Staples said, that, yeah, it sounds like the city council is hoping not for a complete redo. I think the planning board, though, will have to be keeping abreast of what's going on and deciding whether or not we feel that the changes that are being made are adequate. As Mr. Duval pointed out, it's really in our wheelhouse. And we're playing very nice with the city council, but that doesn't mean we have to capitulate on something that we disagree on with regard to the comp plan. And to that end, I think it's going to be really important that we include, we don't generally have sort of reports from individual board members, but I think it'll be important that we include reports from those board members on this committee in each meeting. So that they can keep us abreast of what's going on with it, so that we can provide feedback, so that when they go back to the committee, they're able to speak with authority on behalf of the board rather than sort of flailing in the dark, so to speak, hoping that they're moving in a direction that will be amicable to the board as we move forward.
That's a good idea.
I agree with that. I was going to propose a standing item on our agendas going forward.
Is there anyone here? Oh, I guess that was another item that we wanted to bring up. And of course, there's only 4 members here, but if there's anyone that's really wants to be part of that committee.
I would be very interested in that.
Okay.
I'm also interested.
So I think, Megan, since we do have absences here, I think this is actually something we need to put out to the group on email, and here they can reply directly to you with their interest.
Okay.
Taking, of course, that Mr. Martelli and Mr. Staples are interested.
And is this something that the board would want to vote on next month if there's multiple members that want to be part of this committee? We recommend these 2 apply, and obviously the city council has the final say, but.
Actually, the city council cannot have the final say with regard to process. We are not concurrently allowed to serve on both the planning board and any other committee or board to which we are appointed by the city council. So if it's the council's intent that the planning board is involved in this, they're going to have to be happy with whatever process we choose for appointment and with whomever we choose to appoint, because they can't appoint members of the planning board members to this committee and allow those planning board members to continue as planning board members.
That's correct. So I think, Megan, to answer your question, that we will need to vote on this regardless. I mean, this is our process. So the appointments, I think we have to hear everyone that has put their name forward, and then vote on who we think we should put forward for this exercise.
All right. So I will, I'll send out that email tomorrow, and then we can get the list going and on the agenda for September.
That sounds great. Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Understanding that possibly more than 2 planning board members will be interested, can I ask that those members that are interested, please indicate with, a sentence or 2 why they're interested in doing this? Simply because if there's a list of names of members in front of me, I might make choices based on my own assumptions. But if I can see what their interest is, that might make a difference in my decision.
Yeah, I agree, Mr. Sear. Thank you. I was going to make a similar recommendation. I think that when the call goes out, Megan, if staff could just request people give a couple sentences about the board members' interest and specifically why they want to participate in the process.
Mhm.
Thank you. So I actually have a question about the one of the items in the, just a clarification, one of the items in the timeline. It says that the council will begin incremental adoptions in December, January. Can you expand on what that actually means?
Yeah, so I think the intent behind that was adopting individual, I want to say individual sections of the plan, or getting votes in place on individual sections that they're looking to update. But I think I want to double check on that answer. But I believe that was the intent of that timeline.
Okay, so I guess one comment I have then in general, I think is related to one, or maybe it's the same one that Mr. Sear made earlier, which is there will need to be communication between this ad hoc committee and the planning board, and this ad hoc committee and city council that happens on a regular basis. And so that would be the sort of thing I would expect to begin in December/January.
Okay.
That we would have, if the work begins in October, that there would be anything ready for voting in December would be very quick, I would think, depending on the schedule of meetings. I also have a question about the committee structure. It's recommended that there be a total of, 7 people? There is no recommendation about a chair, who they believe would chair that, or how a chair would be determined for that group. And so I would be interested in what the board thinks about who should, maybe not specifically the person, but where the chair should come from, or how that group could arrive at someone to chair the process.
Well, it seems to me that if it's our job to create the comprehensive plan, then maybe the planning board should appoint a chair to this board. Or recommend one. I mean, or it could be a staff member, I would think.
Yeah.
Not a staff member. I don't like the way that feels.
I would say that my personal opinion is that it doesn't much matter to me who the chairperson is and in what capacity they act outside of this committee meeting. What's going to be incredibly important is that the chairperson recognize that although the city council is creating this ad hoc committee, and the ad hoc committee reports to the council, that procedurally these recommendations will all have to go through the planning board first. And so it's not particularly important to me who the chair is, as long as they have an understanding of the procedure for making changes to the comp plan. And they recognize, while they're doing their work, that it is a multi-step process to change the comp plan. And although the committee might be doing its work, they cannot simply take their changes to the city council. So again, I'm not worried about who the chair is. I'm more concerned that whoever they are, whoever this person is, understands the process for amending the comprehensive plan.
That's great, thank you. So what I take from that is that we actually need to develop a workflow for how this ad hoc committee communicates with the planning board and the council, and also how it moves recommendations through the planning board and the council.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I would agree. I think at this point, I think essentially because the mayor chairs the council, and because this committee is not yet formed, I think it's important to develop this understanding sooner than later, and I'm not sure it's best to wait until the committee is formed. So my suggestion would be that the chair of the board begin communications with the mayor to make sure that the council and the board are both clear about expectations and process, so that that can be clearly articulated to the committee. I think that needs to start before the committee is formed. But yes, I think once the committee is formed, they should, I would suggest that they develop a framework for themselves so they understand when they share something, what is the outcome of that going to be. So if they share something simply to the city council, that means that now that will have to go to the planning board and then back to the city council. If they share something to the planning board, it can go directly from the planning board to the city council without a back and forth. It can be shared with both bodies at the same time, but just so that there's that understanding once they're formed.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I do agree that this workflow, or the way that communication happens, will need to be developed before the committee is actually appointed and or convened. So thank you for that. I will work with the mayor on that.
Now, you said that you had Megan, you had some beginning language to talk about the outline of the committee and that sort of thing. It sounds like that's sort of what we're talking about right now.
Yeah,
So who created that?
Eric actually worked on that this week or last week. Let me see.
I think it's, Mr. Stables, I think it's important, and excuse me, Mr. Duval, for jumping in, but I think it's important we talk about that. I guess in my own mind, I would ask if what the chair would like to do at this point. My preference as a board member would be to go through the items that we're discussing in order, and then look at the committee language later, only because I'm worried that we'll get our discussions muddled with regard to those 5 pieces that the council's given us.
Yeah, I think I agree. So you would go back to the council feedback and then discuss this after.
And that's just me personally, and I like to self-advocate. So if that's what makes sense to me, so I'm going to advocate it right now. And if that doesn't make sense to the rest of the board, or if the chair wants to do something different, that's fine. But
no, I agree. I think that working through this document, then working through the other document, we are, as we take notes, as we have this discussion, as Mr. Staples suggests, we are thinking about a process and a committee structure that would work. And so I think it's useful for us to do that work prior to looking at what's been proposed by staff, because then those two things can inform each other. So I've heard so far that timeline feels short. Is that a correct assumption?
I guess
you broke up there.
Sorry, I've heard that to some members of the board, the timeline proposed by City Council feels short.
I think it seems short given the size of the comprehensive plan, but I think it'll really depend on how pointed the committee is and how much homework they choose to do before committee meetings.
Yep.
In terms of, so my personal opinion is that I think it can be done. I think it will just require efficiency.
Agreed.
If Mr. Staples correct with just fine tuning some of the points, the timeline should be fine.
Okay.
So I guess that kind of comes back to us, though. Is this fine tuning that we have thought that the council was talking about? Is that what we want as the planning board? Is that what we're advocating for? Maybe that's a discussion item to go through too. But another point, though, as far as the timeline and the membership, if we're looking at broad changes, and it's hard to tell at this point how many changes there are and where they're focused on and all of that. But we're going from 40 members down to 7 in a year's time. And if you look at the timeline for the 2010 comprehensive plan, it was much longer. So I guess to me, it just seems like a completely different process than what was going on in 2010.
Well, I think you're right. I think it's an absolutely different process. The 2010 comprehensive plan was a complete rewrite. And I look at this as more of an edit. I'll also say, as a planning board member, I look at this timeline and I think it's reasonable, but I also fully recognize that if something comes that we are probably going to be the entity that slows the process down the most. Because city council meets twice a month and we meet once a month. And we are likely to see multiple items coming from this committee in a single meeting. So we'll have either the choice of tackling those at regular meetings or having special meetings. Either way, I think that the timeline doesn't necessarily raise any red flags, but at the same time, I have no qualms as a planning board member saying that if I feel that we need additional time in order to do this responsibly, then that's the time I will take, knowing that I guess for lack of a better way to say it, we can't be rushed on this. We cannot be forced to move faster than we want to move. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I personally concur with that, and that agrees with my thinking as well. If this group were to start in October, that would make, if we only go to June, 8 monthly meetings where things could be brought before the planning board, because they wouldn't get anything to us in October. So that's November, December, and then January through June. So it feels to me like special meetings are probable as part of this process. But I do agree that if we need to, sticking to that hard July 2021 deadline, I don't think that should be a hard deadline at all. I think we need to take the time we need to take with the recommendations that a committee makes for us. We owe that much to the city. So we've talked about the role that planning board should have, and that would include reviewing. So we'll write these out. Reviewing any recommendations before they go to city council. Have regular updates from the ad hoc committee. And then place several of its members on the committee. Am I missing anything there?
I would tend to change the language in your first point, in that we won't simply review these items. In order for these items to go to council for change of the comprehensive plan, it's my understanding, and Megan, correct me if I'm wrong, it requires not that we've reviewed the information, it requires that we have taken action.
Yeah, we have to propose recommendations. You're absolutely right.
Oh.
Correct. Yep.
So, and I'm not sure exactly how you would write that, but I think just that it goes beyond review. I don't want to give the committee the false sense that.
No, our charge is clear. We prepare the comprehensive plan, and so that's actually, we take the recommendation of this committee, and then we should propose something to city council.
Right.
So is the goal then for each item to be complete and then presented to a planning board meeting for approval before the next, and then we'd go to the next item in the comprehensive plan?
I mean, I think so. If they wanted to bring multiple recommendations or multiple pieces of work to us,
sure,
for us to think about at a single meeting, we could do that.
Okay, but they're a planning board vote per item then.
Yes, unless we choose to combine them.
Okay.
We can choose to lump things and make a single recommendation of multiple items from a committee.
Sure.
It just depends on how things come together and how discussions go.
I think that will depend on how those things dovetail together. Those things that we think really are not separate from each other, I assume we will group together as a single recommendation, whereas two things that may not particularly have a large impact on each other, we may choose to leave separate. But.
Yep. Okay, so we have those three things: recommendations, regular updates / communication, and representation. Are there any other aspects of our role that we're overlooking?
I guess this might seem nitpicky. I recognize, I got the sense from the city council's discussion that they were very much of the opinion that things were going to come from this committee to them. And that's absolutely okay. And then they can then send it after they've gone through their filter to the planning board, and we would then send it back to the council. But I think it's important that we know that I think one of the pieces here is that we will need to be reported to the council as well. So that when we are sending these recommendations, I think at least one of us, either the chair or someone appointed by the chair to act on the board's behalf, will represent us for those recommendation discussions.
Right. So when we make a recommendation, we will have to bring that to the city council. Some member of the planning board will need to do that.
And we don't have to. I just think that if we're going to talk about our role, I think that this is one of those things that we're not required to do that. But given this is the comprehensive plan, and it's a fairly important document, I think it would be good to do so.
Yeah, within our purview and appropriate to do.
Right.
Got it. Thank you. Any other thoughts before we move to important topics? Okay, regarding the topics, do planning board members have comments about those that have been proposed by staff and or those that have been proposed by city council?
I think that if we are going to look at a turnpike exit near 136, and if the council is identifying that as a topic of interest, that needs to happen in conjunction with a review of the density for residential dwellings in that area. And to piggyback off that, I think if the city council is committed to downtown development, and as part of that downtown development, they're looking at where residential housing can be increased, I think it would also be important that in the comprehensive plan, we review the density recommendations for at least the residential zones, the most dense residential zones, particularly those that exist within the downtown.
I got a question that maybe Mr. Sear might be able to answer. This exit by 136 has been explored before, right?
They were discussing this when I was, in kindergarten. So yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't know if there was maybe previous studies on the housing density and stuff like that that might already exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I'm
a
sure
good
it's
question.
changed since, obviously, but I didn't know if that might we might have some documents we could start with.
Yeah.
Under the new Auburn master plan, that was one of the things that was discussed in depth, and it never materialized in any direction. So
I also must say that I wonder where you're going to put those cars coming into town off the turnpike in New Auburn.
Right.
that's where they're planning on having them come, up
Right.
Riverside or up Main Street.
Yep. Other comments, thoughts about items on this list?
Yeah, I guess, are we just talking about 1 through 5, or are we talking about the city councils as well?
I think we can talk about all of them.
Yeah, so fragmentation of, there's a little bit, is that just gateways? Okay, it's just gateways. Okay. I'm actually looking forward to some fragmentation in the downtown. I think that would create a walkable downtown, but it sounds like that's not there. Okay. All right.
Yeah, this was actually a recommendation that was made by former planning board member Mr. Carrier, and he had specifically mentioned South Main Street, Washington, and hotel roads, and he had talked about industrial uses and a mix of residential and industrial type uses. I don't think he mentioned anything about the downtown specifically in his suggestions.
Okay.
So could staff say more about what the thinking was on the equity portion?
Yeah, this was something that was discussed by the mayor, and he was hoping for there to be some sort of, he referred to it as a litmus test question that's basically a generalized questionnaire that could be used for every chapter in the comprehensive plan, to go through them and make sure that there's nothing in there that would present an inequity or a lack of access or opportunity in the city for developers, homeowners, and the like. So they had talked about a tool that's already out there that we were going to look at, the American Public Health Organization, Health in All Policies. So we were going to see if that's something that already exists that we might be able to use to go through each of those sections, rather than having the planning board and the council come up with a generalized list, because it's a pretty in-depth task to start from scratch and do that. So
Could you provide an example of something that would be inequitable? It's probably pretty easy to do. I just curious what that would be.
in the comp plan,
Well, yeah, under this clause.
he didn't mention anything specifically that he wanted us to look at that's in the comp plan that he thinks may be an inequitable. Yeah, he didn't give us any specific examples, so I'm not sure what he was getting at in the comp plan currently. That might be something that he was looking into. I'm not sure.
Generally, it sounds good. I just don't really know exactly what it means.
I guess as I brainstorm it, so I'm thinking out loud here. I apologize. I'm not speaking for anyone in particular. And I'm speaking out loud. I'm a verbal processor. I'm thinking, I'm thinking about, for instance, the way zoning and setbacks and density is done downtown, promotes a specific type of housing, but it does not necessarily promote a market rate type housing. It really promotes it sort of incentivizes landlords to be, I think, take advantage of. I apologize for the dog. The doorbell just rang. To take advantage of subsidized housing, and not that landlords are irresponsible, but there are certainly some landlords downtown that have buildings that, you know, are in disrepair, I think is the nicest way to say it. But that you don't necessarily see that, say, in a residential zone, similar to the one that I happen to live in, and is, I guess I would look at that and say, is that driven by the zones themselves or not? Is there inequity in that, or is that simply something that's occurring on its own outside of the zoning itself? I wonder if that's maybe what we're looking at.
Which is not necessarily an issue of equity, but rather how zones drive development.
Right, but the idea is like, do they like, I'm thinking,
do they preferentially select for one type of?
So in order to, say, live in my neighborhood on, you know, out by the lake, right? So I live out by the lake. In order to live in this neighborhood, you've got to be able to afford, you know, at least the 3 acres. And there's no neighborhood, there's no like nice little neighborhood for starter homes. And there's no, you know, like there's no access. There's no, like, you know, when my purchase here, right? And there are some people that might never be able to purchase here, but is it simply because of the real estate market, or is it because we've developed a zone that sort of creates that market? You know, we've eliminated, you know, a startup home sort of neighborhood style existence in this entire part of the town.
Yep. So the 3 acre zone, or the 3 acre requirement, then actually restricts who has the ability to live there.
And that may be okay. There may not be an issue of equity there. Again, I'm thinking out loud. I'm trying to process what this means.
No, I know, but I'm actually just trying to.
I think that's a really good point. But also, isn't it? It's somewhat the intent of why we came up. It was not to limit the equity of people, but to limit the amount of I don't know if that necessarily precludes people from being able to get in, but it's meant to an extent decrease the density of houses in those kind of areas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, I guess that would be okay from an equity standpoint, as long as we don't have, as long as we're essentially not creating a situation where the only place someone who's a first-time home buyer or who maybe doesn't have the same earning potential, as long as they can access homes throughout the city in varied environments, I think that's fine. As long as we don't find that, say, like the only place someone can afford to live as a first-time home buyer, sort of like right downtown or something like that, then that would be I think that would be fine. I think maybe that's what we'd be looking at, you know?
Right. So it's considerations of things like access to schools, access to roadways, access
transportation,
to parks, access to transportation, access to amenities, etc. So,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, you're fine.
So could this also, I would think it would probably go into areas outside of residential as well. So, you know, if you have a business that's opening up in one zone versus another zone, are you missing out on certain city services or access to who knows what, right? I mean, it must be something like that as well.
Yep.
Yeah, I would agree. You know what? I'm going to put this on the table. I'm thinking about this. as I'm sitting here in my office, I'm realizing this is sort of like the pink elephant in the room looming behind me. It's occurring to me that we're inevitably going to have a discussion about the ag zone if we're discussing equity as well, and what if any issues there are there as well. Dana's right. I think it needs to go. We're going to have to think about that. Maybe it's not just residential zones. It's like, are we talking? What about conservation zones, the ag zones, the industrial zones? One industrial zone, the industrial zones on Minot Ave versus the industrial zones on Washington Ave.
Yep. There will be multiple ways to look at this. I think from my mind, when I think about equity, there are so many different ways into this. I wonder if this is something they want us to tackle, and I think it's a good thing, is that we will need a lot of support and training to be able to tackle this from the many different angles necessary as a city. Not we, the planning board, but we, the planning board, because in the end we will be making recommendations, will need to think hard about the various different axes and various different ways to think about equity when thinking about the comp plan.
When we discuss equity, when I think about the discussion of equity, we're really most often discussing access to resources, and that doesn't necessarily mean physical resources per se, although it often can mean physical resources, capital resources, time, civic resources. I think that we would be well served to identify a tiered system in saying, if the idea is that we're going to be reviewing things ongoing, that we say, what are those things that we think are the most important with regard to equitable access, right? Yep. Like access to a sidewalk might be low on the list, right? Whereas access to quality outdoor recreation areas might be much higher on the list, right? As an example. And so I'm foreseeing that we might want to create a tiered system so that we can focus ourselves instead of trying to solve all problems, decide which problems do we think most need to be looked at first, or even to determine if there are problems with access to those things first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that it becomes basically a listing of values. So it becomes a value proposition, and these are the things we value. I would also add to access. I would also add that it's the distribution of resources as well, right? So your discussion of where a starter home can be purchased is about distribution of resources as much as it is about access to them.
I think that comes down to that highlights that we're going to need to create definitions, right? Because
exactly,
I would have said, well, to me that really is an access issue, but it points out that
it's both.
If we're going to have a discussion, we need to have definitions of those terms.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is actually both, right? It's not just access, it's not just distribution, it's both access and distribution, because the two go hand in hand. Right. Any other thoughts on these 7 items?
I guess just one more thought I had on equity. If we're going to make that some sort of a qualification or criteria for approving anything in the future, I think we have to have a relatively high threshold for what we consider to be equitable, just so that all of the city that currently exists as it is can't go back and say, well, what about me? I'm not equitable. Because if we're just starting to look at something like this, then we're going to find pretty quickly a lot of areas that don't pass our muster as far as what we judge to be equitable.
Yeah,
I know.
well, there's identifying inequity and then there's fixing it, right?
Sure.
So I think, this is the work of this ad hoc committee is going to be, I think, as Evan suggests, to come up with some definitions. Certainly, if they don't do that and something comes in front of us, I think it might be a long conversation. But are there other comments on these items or other items that people would like to see on this list?
I guess one more thing I would really like reviewed is, and I recognize that this might not be able to get taken care of in the timeline presented, but the planning board can suggest ongoing edits to the comp plan. So yeah, if we choose to do this after, that's fine. But the idea, visiting the idea that the number of zones in the future land use plan is many, perhaps too many. There are a lot of land use zones. In my mind, essentially what that does is it creates confusion, and it necessitates division between one zone and another on some sort of minute detail that may or may not still be deemed important based on the city's strategic plan.
Yeah,
and the goals of the council.
Yeah,
Need to simplify it.
It lends itself to plot level interpretation, which is then it's definitively not the point of the plan. So I agree, that's a good one.
Yeah, and you had talked earlier about how after the 2010 comp plan, there wasn't a comprehensive rezoning done. Is there any mechanism by which we can trigger that through the rebuild of a comp plan?
We can, and so we did this after the last comp plan. We can create the zones that are described in the comprehensive plan. So for instance, we did that. We took one zone that was created, that was described in the comprehensive plan. The planning board drafted the language. We did the work to develop, essentially develop an entirely new zone. We did not recommend that any land be rezoned. However, we did send the language to the council for adoption. The council saw no need to implement the comp plan at that time, and so chose to just reject the language outright, and so that zone was never created. So having said that, one thing we can do is we can create those zones and send that to the city council. What I can tell you, that depends on whether or not the city council wants to engage in that process. The other, which I had mentioned when we started talking about this, is that we recommend to the city council that there be language in the ordinance regarding the comprehensive plan that defines a timeline or a date by which the comprehensive plan must be implemented with regard to zoning. So,
okay,
there are other options,
but like you said, if the council's not ready for that and they're not going to listen to it, we want to make sure that we're collaborative in that.
Right.
So
Yep.
let me just clarify that. What I think I heard, Mr. Sear, you were saying that we actually put that within this update of the comp plan.
Well, here's the thing. I think that it is a related but separate issue, and that the comp plan needs to be updated, and that I would personally not want to see any updates being jeopardized because they necessarily have to or are grouped with this idea that they will be implemented. I would rather make a case for that separate from the comprehensive plan update committee.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What I've seen them do in other communities is, as part of the comp plan update, they create implementation committees that are responsible for taking the action items and implementing them, bringing them before the planning board, getting the planning board's recommendations in council, and getting them codified. So that's another option the planning board could consider.
Well, we have those, and those are defined in our comprehensive plan, the issues that it requires that those entities, actually do it. So.
Yeah. Okay. More additions. I have one addition here. That Mr. Sear proposed. Are there any other thoughts from the board? Okay, hearing none, I would say we should move on to the document about the development of that committee. So this was drafted by staff, is that correct?
Yes. Yep. And this was just shelled out last week as something to start. And staff was just hoping for the planning board to take a look at it and let us know your thoughts on the duties that have been laid out and the responsibilities, time commitment, and those sorts of things.
I felt it was reasonable. However, I think that for the committee's sake, this sounds nitpicky, but they may want to, we might want to include language with regard to the commitment, specifically saying that like additional meetings may be deemed necessary by the committee, so that someone doesn't join this saying, great, I'm only meeting once a month.
Right.
Only to find that once they start, the committee decides that they want to meet twice a month. Right? And that being a surprise. Whereas if you realize ahead of time, okay, this is a one meeting a month commitment, but it's possible for that to change. Well, you at least know that going in.
So as we look at what's on the screen now from staff, given our earlier conversation, how do people feel like these numbered options?
I guess I don't follow your question.
So, okay, number one, commit to constructive discussion, fine. Number two, identify solutions and make recommendations on challenges and opportunities identified by the council. That seems to me to be incongruous with the discussion we had earlier about the actual purview and role of the planning board. Attending regularly, the rest of these I think are all number 7 we could rewrite in some way because of
Mr. Chairman, I apologize, and this is highly unorthodox. Someone is at the door and is being quite persistent, and my daughters are here, but my wife is not here, and I'd like to check on them. May I please be excused?
Yes, absolutely. So maybe one thing we should do is let's take a short recess to see if Mr. Sear comes back. But as it is, we can consider aspects of this document that we may want to suggest are changed.
We're gonna take 5-ish.
Ish, yeah.
Okay. Be right back.
Sorry about that. I apologize. It was
That's okay, Mr. Sear. We have taken a short recess here.
excellent.
So Mr. Staples and Mr. Martelli have stepped out. I'm going to step out for just a second, and then we can get back when everybody returns.
Okay.
All right, with Mr. Bergeron's return, I think we can resume our meeting here. So regarding the responsibilities of members, numbers 2 and 7 seem to be inconsistent to me with the conversation we were having earlier about the planning board role in the comprehensive plan update. Am I misreading these, or do other members of the board agree?
I agree. Yeah. They should be reporting to, well, we should be identifying challenges and opportunities, not the council, right? Based on our feedback from each meeting.
Or both?
Sure.
They could do it as well.
Sure.
I think it's certainly fine for the council to provide their, to identify challenges and opportunities with regard to the comprehensive plan. I think it should probably read identified by the council and planning board. I think it will be incredibly important that the committee just recognize that they are certainly welcome to bring something to the city council first, because ultimately the city council is the board that will choose to adopt, whether or not to adopt any recommended changes, but that the process requires that the planning board that the council cannot act on something that the planning board has not sent them, I guess. And so it's just, I absolutely see what you're saying, Mr. Duval. And I think it really hinges upon their conceptual understanding of the process. And if they understand the process correctly, I think that they can look at that and say, well, that means that, sure, we can share things with the council, but ultimately it's going to go through the planning board before it goes to the council. And I would make the same comment with regard to number 7. They can consult and offer advice to the planning board and the city council by drafting a report and recommendations on each of the above issues, as long as they recognize what the process is. Then there's no issue with that sentence. It just requires that they have an understanding of the process.
Yeah. So I guess, to clarify this, I would suggest that in looking at this list myself, items 1 and 7 are really part of a charge to the committee that I think the language can be cleaned up. Whereas items 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are actually descriptions of ways as a community we want to interact. And so for me, I would separate those two functions and put a charge to this committee along the lines of that describes as it lays out the charge that actually describes the process, and then follow with what it's supposed to work on, and then follow with how we expect people to interact.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Need to talk about Mr. Shear's point a little bit. I guess I just would want to be very careful not to have conflicting views from the planning board and the city council in any way confuse the committee and what they're supposed to be doing. If we tell them to do one thing and the council tells them to do another, they have to make a decision. Do they do, if they're conflicting? So I don't know. In my professional, I was just saying in my professional experience, everything is always better if it comes from one person, even if it's that one person is influenced by several people, you know?
Yeah, so if I may make a suggestion here that might help this, and that is per Mr. Sears' comment earlier that I should sit down with the mayor and talk about the process and potentially this document along with staff and actually clarify that in the outset. That speaks to a lot of the issues that you're talking about, Mr. Staples, and that you were talking about, Mr. Sear.
Right.
Mr. Staples, it is going to happen. The council will have their opinion about something, and we will have our opinion about something. And ultimately, the committee will need to make a decision as to what they believe is the best solution. And then it's going to have to go through our filter. And once it goes through our filter, it'll go through the city council filter. And
that's government.
It is not a new thing. And I've seen it happen several times. And sometimes it runs fairly smoothly, even when there are differing opinions. And sometimes it's a real opportunity to grab some popcorn and watch an interesting meeting. So
yeah, fair enough. I just wonder if there were an instance where we had one opinion and the council had a different opinion, if it would make more sense for our boards to get together to provide direction as one unit, you know, to this committee, just so that, like, these people this is a volunteer committee that's an extra thing, for them to sit in one place and see two different people doing the thing and just saying different things. It just doesn't seem to, I don't know. I understand what you're saying, and I totally agree with you, and I know that you're probably right, but it would be great to be able to avoid it.
So again, I think that this speaks to the process issue, and we can certainly mitigate what Mr. Sears is talking about, but I don't think if it wants to happen, it's going to happen.
Sure. Yeah, and I do think your idea to have a meeting with the mayor just to talk policy, I think is probably very appropriate.
Yeah, I think that ideally too, the makeup of the committee would lend itself to developing those compromises in committee before it comes back to us, because there are members of both the council and the board on it. So,
sure.
Agreed. This is a small committee, so people are going to have to carry a fair amount of water.
Right. Yes.
Other thoughts about this description of the working group? So hearing none, I guess I would ask staff if they have enough to capture what we've discussed here. I guess, so if you could just articulate what needs to happen on your end, according to city council.
Sorry, I was muted. I think this is the right one. Yeah. So I was just taking some notes as we went through the discussion. What we have to do for this upcoming meeting is provide just a communication from the planning board, or it can come from staff that was at the planning board meeting, to the city council, and just letting them know your thoughts on the timeline, the planning board role, topics, and then the committee, formation of the committee. So I just typed all this as we were talking. I obviously haven't gone through it and refined it down. But I guess the main issue is that it has to be in by tomorrow. So I don't know if it's something that maybe I can work with the chair on, or we can wordsmith it tonight and get something that the planning board wants to ship over to the city council.
So it feels to me, given time, that we have some other things that we'd like to deal with, that I would propose to the committee or to the board that I work with staff tomorrow in the morning to put something together that we can put in front of City Council.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
That sounds good.
That's fine. Yep.
I'll get this down to something concise that we can work with.
Great, thank you. So moving on to item 6, the staff report format. So we received, after the last planning board meeting, we received some suggestions from one of the board members to add 2 items to the staff report. One being to explain how the items under review relate to the comprehensive plan. So this would be something that's always in the staff report. And the second would be to clearly articulate the underlying zoning districts that are in question, given the item under review.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think it would be good for not only planning board members. I think it would be good for the public that's viewing the documents. I think it's helpful for the applicant. So it gives them sort of a heads up of what the discussion might be about.
Is there, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Is there a specific format that the planning board would like to see this in the staff report?
So I don't have one in mind. I think just before the staff recommendation, somewhere in there, a section that talks about these things. I don't know if anyone else on the board has an opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that would work with regard to identifying the underlying zoning districts. I wonder with regard to the comp plan, if it could be similar to the planning committee reports, right? Such that, we see fire department, and if there are concerns, they have concerns, and if there are none, there are none. So something similar to that with regard to the comprehensive plan. So something like conflict with comprehensive plan, and if there's no conflict, then it simply says none. And if there's a conflict, there's the description of that conflict. Just also to make it easier for staff, so staff is not trying to weave it into the narrative of the staff report, so that way they can just sort of clearly knock that out on one spot also, I think.
Yeah, I like that idea.
That makes sense to me.
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay, I think this is probably something we have to vote on because it becomes a sort of procedure of the planning board.
I don't know if we necessarily have to vote on it. I don't think we define what has to be in the staff report.
Okay.
In any of our bylaws. So I wonder if simply asking staff is enough.
I'm fine to not vote. Staff, does that seem reasonable to you?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. We'll move on to item 7, which is called the creation of subcommittees. Again, after the last meeting, there was a communication from a member of the board that thought it might be a good idea to update some policies and create some internal documents for the planning board to use in its meetings. One way these updates and creation of materials could be done within planning board meetings. We typically don't have a lot of time within our meetings, and so if we want to do them as a whole board, then workshopping some of these would be a possibility as well. Another option that we found out is the creation of subcommittees. There has been a moratorium on subcommittees in the city, but not subcommittees that are limited in membership to just members of the board. So we can subcommittee ourselves. We can't add anybody. The recommendations fell really in kind of three groups that you can read here. Updating policies and procedures. There are some suggested items there. The creation of a land use matrix, which would help, I think, the planning board be able to understand the different uses within the different zones rather quickly. And then the creation of some guided notes on the different processes that are normally undertaken by the planning board. So I just want to open this up. What does the planning board think of doing this work first?
Well, if I'm looking at the three items on the list, it seems to me that policies and procedures of the planning board, I'm just guessing here, but something tells me that shouldn't be that huge of an undertaking to do. And I would guess that the third one as well isn't overly big. The second item to me seems like kind of a timely or a time-consuming item, rather. So I don't know. To me, a subcommittee is something that meets on a regular basis with a certain task in mind, and I don't know that a subcommittee would be necessary to accomplish some of these. On the other hand, if we don't have one, then we have to do it in a meeting. So I see why you guys put that on the agenda like that. So. Yeah. What do you guys think?
Other thoughts from the board?
Well, I think that when I look at this, oftentimes, so I know that, for instance, staff already has the basic framework of a matrix, of a land use matrix. I think Mr. Staples is correct. C, the frequently asked questions, C, and guided notes for special exceptions, subdivision, and site plan review, really primarily consists of a copy paste out of the ordinance with basic descriptions included. Those are things that I think don't necessarily require approval from the board at large. Updating the policies and the procedures will require the entire board. I don't think it would be unreasonable if we identified individuals who were interested in doing B and C or A as well. I guess I just think, in my mind, it'll be important that the board do that. I look at B and C, and I know that staff is more than qualified to do that for us. My thought being that the membership, the members of the board are so new that it's almost in our best interest to familiarize ourselves with this, rather than asking staff to simply develop an end product for us. I guess that was a long way to say I guess I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other with regard to subcommittees, other than that I think it's really important that members of the board do the work and that we not ask staff to do it.
So, and I guess that's back to the original prompt, which is this work that the board feels is important? I think Mr. Sear sees value in it. I can see value in it. I wonder what others think.
Well, Mr. Duval brings up an important point. We don't want to take on work if it's not viewed as valuable by the board as well. So.
I would certainly read anything that was presented to us, and I'm sure that I would find value in it. I don't really know, like, what is it? Is it because there's so many new people on the board that this information was requested? Is that like just a training kind of exercise more than anything?
Yes.
As one of those new members, I think that land use matrix would be helpful. Sounded like, I mean, that would be a good material to have at hand.
Unfortunately, two of our newest members are not here tonight. So we can't hear from them on whether or not they feel this would be valuable work to do.
On all levels, I think it would be, good to have where that problem is coming from and where can we solve it. So, and this would take care of that.
Well, another, just like one of the sub points there says dress code, and then the documents I got, I don't know, I'm not aware of a dress code, so I would at least want to be kept abreast of that if that was a thing.
Well, and so that's what
Not
these
in this guy.
these updating policies and procedures would be to consider, for example, we want a dress code. And do we want to create a sort of outlining of procedures of how public hearings run, what the order of different things in, when it's appropriate to ask questions, of what types of questions and discussion happen in different parts of a public hearing, et cetera. Who can place items on future planning board agendas? So it would be an exploration of those sorts of policies and procedures of the planning board, which could be useful to new members.
Yep. That's good.
But I think as a group, we have to want to do the work. And if it's not something that we think is important at this time, then
Well, I guess I would, for my 2 cents, I would say that if we were going to do this as a board, I wouldn't want to tackle one of these items on a busy night.
nope. There generally it wouldn't be time, right?
Right.
So, other options would be to do workshops, or as is suggested here, have small groups of the planning board actually work on each of these items and then bring them back to the board.
Considering our lack of attendance tonight, is it a good idea to do workshops?
That's a good question. So what I'm hearing right now from the board is not a lot of enthusiasm for this. I
So
wish
I will put my plug in as nearly a 9-year member of the planning board right now. So I think back to our last public hearing, which was to review the Edward Little High School, the proposed site plan. And there seemed to be confusion amongst members with regard to what was in our purview to discuss, what authority we had to make specific changes, what the implications of specific changes might be, or the implication of specific types of wording might be. For instance, there was a discussion about changing where the bus drop off and the the parent drop-off would be, and whether or not that should be included in conditions. And so when you have that discussion, it's important for board members to recognize what the implication of putting something as a condition is to a site plan, right? Because it may be valid to do so, it may be appropriate, it may not be. It may be in the city's best interest to ask an applicant to do that, and it may not be. When I look at it, I would say if the board is not interested in doing some of the, is maybe not interested in doing some of the work to sort of create explanations of these things, I would highly suggest that all members of the board at least read through the ordinance and all of the ordinance specific to special exception, subdivision, site plan review. Only because I think it would, had everyone on the board had a better understanding of those processes, I think our discussion would have been a little more efficient in the last meeting.
And maybe to explain some of the hesitancy from the board about doing this work. I mean, for me, it's difficult to come in and say, I think I could present good work in any of these areas, given my inexperience in the board. I could say my opinion, but I don't know that I would necessarily have a lot to draw from an experience, So I think a lot of these items really require, a base of knowledge that I don't have.
I like to echo Mr. Staples' opinion on that.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your feedback on this. I think I'm hearing pretty clearly that the board, or at least the people present, are not interested in actually tackling any of these things. There was a suggestion made that people spend some time with the ordinance around special exception, subdivision, site plan review. And also generally I hear a veiled, maybe it's very thickly veiled request to consider training of new planning board members and how we think about how we actually onboard people into this process. So I will circle back, as chair, I'll circle back with staff on that.
It might be a good time to add, I did attend the Maine Municipal Association's training this past couple weeks ago, I guess.
Yep.
I found that valuable for sure. And I'm sure that as I attend more of these meetings and prepare for more of these meetings, I'll get the hang of things. But it's just a matter of doing it.
Yep. Okay. Any other thoughts on this item before we move on?
Nope.
Okay, so we come to item 8, public comment. There actually are no members of the public present. So we can open it, which I think we're required to do. So I would need a motion.
Oh, not a public hearing, so not required a motion.
Oh, public,
Chair.
yeah.
I know, right?
Right.
Public comment and the public hearing requires the motion. Public
Yep.
comment and the agenda doesn't.
Thank you. So seeing that there are no members of the public, we will move on to item 9, miscellaneous. And that one's going to get me every single time, Mr. Sear.
That's okay.
Upcoming items for September. Staff, what do you got?
So far, it's looking like a light agenda again. There's a lot of projects that are kind of looming out there that will probably show up in October, I'm guessing now. We have one minor amendment for the Lake Auburn Water Pollution Control Authority. They're just changing some language in their agreement that was approved by the planning board several years ago. So you'll be seeing that, and you may see with the change in the meeting date where we can extend our deadline to this Friday for submission materials. Usually it would have been last Friday. So we may have a little bit of extra time for people that want to sneak projects in between now and Friday. So you may see Gammon's Garden Center. They're looking to add some greenhouses out there. So those are the only two that we have. And then as we put on the agenda, the City Council is hoping to change the meeting date from September 8th to potentially September 15th, which is the following Tuesday, if that works for the planning board. But any other date after September 8th is fine too.
Okay, so, and this is, because it's a departure from our normal meeting date per bylaws, I think we have to vote on changing this date.
Yep.
So I would need a motion, a second, and then we would need to vote.
I make a motion to change the date of the regular September meeting of the planning board from September 8th to September 15th.
Second.
2020.
I have a second.
Second.
Thank you.
Mr. Bergeron,
Yes.
Mr. Sear,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
Mr. Staples. I think he's frozen.
Yes.
And Chairman Duval.
Yes. So item B in miscellaneous is other items for discussion from the board. Does anyone on the board have any items they want to put forward? Hearing none, we'll go to item number 1, which is actually moot at this point. The city manager and the mayor have issued a policy statement under the governor's emergency declaration about how boards and committees across the city will meet. We will send that to you. Well, staff will send that to you after the meeting, so probably tomorrow. And in short, what it means is that our next meeting on the 15th will be in person in council chambers, right, staff?
Correct. Yep.
Without Ms. Norwood present, but Mr. Cousins will be. Anybody else, or is it just going to be Eric?
I believe it's just going to be Eric. I won't be here for September, and I likely won't be here for October because I will be out on maternity leave. So
okay. Great.
Everyone knows.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck.
And have fun.
Thanks.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So yes, we'll be in person. We will be physically distant within the meeting. I think the Auburn guidelines require that if you can't be physically distant, you have to mask, but otherwise you are not required to wear a mask. Anything else I'm missing, Megan? I think that's...
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it.
That's the gist of it. The public will not be present in council chambers, correct?
Correct. I believe they put them across the hallway in the community room.
Yeah.
And they them in as they want to speak on an item.
Yeah, I think that's right. Too.
But I'm hoping it looks like we've only got one minor item so far on the agenda, so it'll be a good trial run meeting, I think.
Yeah, and city council's already done this, so there is institutional knowledge.
Yes.
Great. Any other items from the board?
No.
Hearing none, that moves us to item 10. I need a motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Mr. Bergeron,
Yes.
Mr. Sear,
Yep.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
Mr. Staples,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yep. Thank you all. And we will see you on the 15th.
Till next time.
Take care.